because AI is constantly giving you affirmations. It's giving you that kind of dopamine of like, you're great, you're doing great, like you're a genius or whatever. And it kind of slips into kind of AI psychosis. If I see someone smiling without having to take the person's position or imagine myself when I smile, what is my affective state? I can just tell from someone smiling that they're happy. And for her, that's a way that we encounter the other without having to refer back to ourselves in a world that is becoming more and more instrumentalized, where not only we instrumentalize things, we instrumentalize other people, like online with influencers. Through the sense of wonder, I think we can almost de-instrumentalize people. That's why I call it like the eternalisation of the present, where the present becomes the eternal. And the way I kind of imagine it in my head is that if you're like a ping pong ball that is spinning in air in the same spot, but it's not moving forward or backward, it's just in the same spot, but it's gaining speed, it's accelerating. And I think that was a mental image that perfectly kind of encapsulate what the cultural industry is doing.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anagogia podcast. Today, I have Allister, which did a talk at the conference that was also attending an international conference of philosophy of mind focused on artificial intelligence. So I thought that his talk was pretty cool. So I just got in touch and I checked some of his other work. So I thought it'd be pretty cool to take the opportunity that we were both in the same place and to actually have a little chat about some of his ideas, which I'm really looking forward to exploring.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure. Before we get started, maybe just give kind of a quick intro about yourself, like a couple minutes, who you are, and also some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so I'm doing my PhD in the University of Exeter at the moment. My research topic looks at how digitally mediated encounters can be a way to build online communities, and in what conditions do they kind of collapse into being a kind of mass sociality where people are just actually more alone than they are together. And I look at this through Edith Stein's social philosophy, phenomenological approach. Edith Stein is a bit of a lesser known character within the phenomenological tradition. She was an early student of Husserl back in Freiburg, and she wrote her dissertation on the problem of empathy, which was published later on after she graduated. She worked as a research assistant for Husserl when he was writing Ideas 2, and then later on she converted to Catholicism. And because of the social political reasons at the moment, at that point, she couldn't go into teaching in academia in the university, so she was doing teaching in schools or private tutors and stuff like that. And because she has a Jewish background, when the Nazis came into power, she was at that point she joined the Carmelite order in Cologne, and then she had to escape to Netherlands, and she was caught in the Netherlands, and then she was transported to Auschwitz, and she later died in the concentration camps. So yeah,
I was actually not familiar with Stein at all. Like I've seen the name here and there, but like I knew nothing of it. So kind of reading one of your works, I suppose it was an essay, or was it a paper draft?
Well, it was a draft for a paper in a conference, but it's currently being developed into a chapter of my thesis.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, awesome. So that was really interesting to me, and because again, like you said, it's not kind of a major figure, so I'm assuming that it's the same level of knowledge or background for a lot of other people. So maybe give a little bit of context and background about her philosophy in general, like what was she trying to do? And then we'll pick up from there of kind of how you use it.
Yeah, so my research focuses at the moment in her earlier phenomenology, what I kind of consider her pre-conversion work. As I mentioned earlier, she wrote her dissertation on the problem of empathy. In her own autobiography, she wrote that she was listening to a lecture by Husserl, and he brought up the term empathy, which at that point was being used by Theodor Lipps, another kind of psychologist, philosopher of our time, who kind of put out a kind of simulation theory of empathy. We can go into that a bit later. And she's like, this is not satisfactory to her, in her view. And she wanted to put forward a phenomenological account of empathy in tandem with Max Scheler, who is another phenomenologist at the time, who was also working on the problem of empathy and sympathy. But for her, empathy, she understood it not as the way we understood it nowadays, as, oh, put your feet into someone else's shoe or taking the position of another person. For her, empathy was more a kind of intuitive, quasi-perceptual experience of another person's own subjectivity. So, and she kind of justified it by saying that there's a sense of unity between the experience and the expression. And this unity is a unity of meaning, right? If I see someone smiling, without having to take the person's position or imagine myself when I smile, what is my affective state? I can just tell from someone smiling that they're happy. And for her, that's a way that we encounter the other without having to refer back to ourselves. And she saw that as a more genuine way of how we move around the world and actually build the world as well, because for her, empathy plays a pretty important role in kind of how we constitute ourselves, how we distinguish ourselves and the other person. Because when I see your smile, when I see your sadness, I know that that is not my sadness. And in that sense, it's through empathy that we kind of distinguish the self and the other. That's the early phenomenological part. But then she transitions into Thomism.
But still on the phenomenology aspect of it. So I from my understanding, part of her argument is that, you kind of apprehend the other like right away, right? It's not like this cognitive process that you're doing. It helped me understand that, like, to me, that still feels somewhat coherent to like the layman understanding of putting yourself in the other shoes. Like, I can understand how that might be a mismatch if you interpret that like very cognitively, of like I'm making an effort and like I'm having this representation of some kind, but it still feels like roughly the same idea of understanding the subjectivity of the other, like you said. So what exactly is the vision that for her, it's a very different concept of how we use it nowadays?
Yeah, so nowadays when we talk about empathy, we kind of have this idea of we have to know the other person's backstory, all their preferences, and all their kind of what they like and what they don't like, the character. Like, that's what we mean by putting ourselves into the other person's shoe, right? And then from then on, we kind of feel like, oh, what would I feel if I were him? But Stein argues that you don't have to do that to know how he feels. You don't have to step into the shoe. You kind of just, at least in the most basic form, basic first stage empathy, you can see someone's affective experience just by the expression. But then she goes on to say, if you want to know more about it, you can utilize imagination. You can utilize simulation to understand more about the person's internal state, like affective state, but it is not a necessary part of empathy.
Okay. And then how does that then eventually evolve to like a more Thomist position?
There is debate in the literature whether Stein is a Thomist or not. So the kind of reason why she kind of turned towards Thomism is because, as she writes, I think in Act and Potency, I think it's her third like kind of big book. It was a desire to kind of unite the two streams of like Husserl's phenomenology and the scholastic tradition. That was actually, I think, becoming more popular in her time with like Etienne Gilson and like the French like neo-scholastic emerging, neo-Thomism emerging. I mean, it was also out of a personal conviction as well of her converting to Catholicism, and I think for her, she was trying to find a way to unite her faith and her not theological, but I would say her religious convictions with her kind of philosophical formation, and so that's kind of how she started engaged with Thomism. She doesn't buy into all of Thomism, but she engages with certain ideas with it, and that's a bit out of my research specialty. to comment more on it.
Gotcha. Okay. At some point in the paper, you mentioned the issue of simulation theory, kind of like how that applies to empathy. Is that kind of like a separate perspective compared to like the more layman understanding, where you kind of like is the layman understanding where you're kind of trying to imagine yourself? Is that exactly this kind of simulation that you mentioned, or is this kind of like a slightly different take on empathy?
Yeah, so simulation theory like includes a wide range of like what we mean by simulation, what is a process of simulation, and Sean Gallagher, I think you've written a really good paper on kind of dissecting. Well, he mentions that there's a lot of different types of simulation theory, and they don't necessarily agree with each other. Not to be too reductive about it, but from my perspective, from my reading of it at least, simulation theory, what ties all of them together under the same like genre is that empathy is done through kind of a process of mirroring and projection. So you start by mirroring, as Goldie calls it, you quarantine your own perspective, your own position, and then you mirror, like you kind of take up the position, you mirror the other person, like what their preferences are, their history, their character, their convictions, and then using those information, you kind of then project what their actions would be, what choices would they make, and it's kind of a predictive process. Like the kind of goal at the end of this process is to predict what the other person would do. And in contrast, Stein doesn't really care much about predicting what the other person would do, more than to just like what is my experience of the other person right now, like my experience with that other subjectivity. What is that subjectivity like, perhaps?
How does she think about on what affects that encounter with the other? Because when I think about, I mean, I haven't put a lot of thought into this, but from time to time, when I do think about empathy, especially when I'm reading kind of more religious literature, something that always comes to mind is that there always seems to be, to me, how some people have this, what I perceive to be almost like a superpower of being really empathetic towards other people. And when I think about it, I always get this sense of shame, almost, that I'm not as empathetic as whatever saint I'm reading or whatever. And I'm always, and to some degree, it feels really odd, because to some degree this is a constant theme of Christianity and religion more broadly, which is to some degree that I can't possibly get to that state, but at the same time, I still can. It's not like it's metaphysically impossible. And also, precisely because there's a normativity into it, it kind of pulls me into it, right? So, and so I kind of have that as a goal of some kind, but then I can't quite achieve it. Like it feels like there's a mediation between me and being able to have the full experience of the other. So she says, okay, it's not anything about prediction. It's just like the encounter itself. Yeah. Okay, so what is grounding that encounter that then produces different levels of empathy in different people? For
Stein, empathy kind of goes in the way of you starting with the emergence of the subject's another subject's experience, right? And then through a second step where you kind of almost feel into, like, that's what empathy, kind of like the translation in German is Einfühlung. It's like you feel into that person. You kind of, the way I think about it is like, if I see in a field of snow footprints, then I know someone's either walking on in the field of snow or has walked in the field of snow, right? And to know where they went, I follow their footsteps. But then because I am a different person from the other I'm a different person, right? My footsteps might be different. Like my footsteps, like I can even when I trace the footsteps, I know that I'm not the person that is the first person to walk the path. I know someone has walked the path, and through that kind of feeling in, I might come to a better knowledge out at the end of this empathetic process, that how did the person get there, right? And to bring it back to empathy, is like, why is this person feeling happy? Why is this person feeling sad? For Stein, I don't think she writes explicitly about it, but I think in the empathetic process, in my own reading of it, and kind of trying to practice it, I usually have a sense of awe, like, because you have your, I mean, not everyone does, but you have your own internal monologue. There's certain deep, like, depth to your own subjectivity that you know about, but then it's hard to know that about the other person. But then when you think about it without having to like be in a person's shoe, but by kind of thinking more about, oh, this person is like this person looks happy, this person looks sad, and then you reflect more on it, and you're like, oh, this person has the equal depth of their subjectivity or depth of their being. Like this person probably has a whole life that is very different from me, but also shares similar structures. It has family, it has commitments, it has interests and passions, and yeah, there's to me like a personal reflection on Stein's work is that I think she's constantly trying to uncover a sense of awe in the world and in the other people that we share the world with.
Does she ever make a direct reference of the ability of that encounter being produced or at least affected by kind of like this shedding of the self in kind of like a very Christian context of like, I'm shedding my passions, and as I do so, I'm more in contact with reality, which is also the other. And therefore, I can have that experience in its highest form if I'm not clouded by my own, well, the monologue is one way to put it, but there's a lot more going on. Yeah. But does she ever kind of make that reference or not quite?
I don't think she does. I think in a sense she kind of makes a very clear juxtaposition between the self and the other in empathy. Is that I think she argues that if we kind of trying to shed ourselves, like, or Simone Weil called, like Arthur Irish Murdoch that calls it, like, you de-self and emerge in the other. You kind of, it's really hard, like for her, that doesn't really sit quite right with Stein. I think for her it was more perhaps following like a phenomenological method. You can do a kind of sort of epoche, like where you withdraw yourself and kind of perceive like let the phenomenon unfold itself as it is. But she never really, to my reading, to my like memory, she doesn't really ever specify that part as a kind of necessary role, because for her, like, empathy is just like any other perception, just like me seeing, me listening, is a basic part of our kind of cognitive, like, perceptual world, and it can go wrong. Like, she's not saying that empathy is 100% correct, and quite the opposite. She dedicates like paragraph or two in saying that like empathy can go wrong in the sense of like when you're playing poker, like people can hide their facial expressions, people can like pretend to be sad when they're not. People can pretend a lot of things, but that doesn't make empathy not the thing it is. Just because I can have a visual illusion doesn't mean I don't trust my vision ever again, right? So I think that's kind of her more less mystical approach.
In this paper, kind of building up from Stein, then you have this whole concept of sycophantasy. Like, help me out here. I can never get this right.
Sycophantasy. It's just combining fantasy and sycophantic, right? So, like right now, like I started off like looking at AI sycophantasy. Like, there's a lot of news stories about how people that spend a lot of time with AI can start like thinking that AI is their girlfriend or their partner, or even worse, I think there's a story in the UK where a man was convinced that he is some sort of special agent I don't know if to protect or to assassinate the queen, but he then tried to like go into Buckingham Palace and he was arrested. Or even more like basic stories in the not basic but very tragic stories in the US where kids who are spending too much time with their AI got convinced their girl like that the AI chatbot is their girlfriends, and then under the kind of coercion or like the illusion, they committed suicide, and there's legal cases about it at the moment. So people have called that like sycophantic AI, where because AI is constantly giving you affirmations, it's giving you that kind of dopamine of like, you're great, you're doing great, like you're a genius or whatever. And it kind of slips into kind of AI psychosis, where we're kind of being convinced by AI that we are something that we're not, right? Like, and it's part of the program. Like I mean, ChatGPT has made some adjustments since then, and there are also interesting stories about how when ChatGPT 5 became less sycophantic, people were mourning it. It's like, I had this great therapist, I had this great friend, but now it's gone. But then I think that makes me question it. Like, is the problem where about the AI chatbots? Certainly it is, but I think it's also how we view friendships and relationships nowadays, and they're supposed to be our hype man. Even like, it's just not the is it the sort of friendship that we want, right? And then and using Stein's one of her concepts of reiterated empathy, which is kind of like, so you can be empathetic about my experience, right? But then through empathy I can empathetically perceive your experience of me, and in that sense it kind of becomes recursive, and I can have a better view of myself. At a very basic level, it's kind of like, I can't see myself or my I can't see myself or my back, my front or my back. But then if I have something in my teeth after a meal, you see it, and then and then you look at me weird, and I'm like, well, why are you looking at me weird? And you're like, you have something in your teeth, and then in that very, very basic physical way, we have a better self-understanding through the other, like by empathizing with the other, right? And what Stein really requires is that there's an otherness, there's the alterity. It kind of, because the other perceives us differently than what we do. And in that reiterated empathy, as Rachel Bath kind of argues in other articles, performs a kind of corrective function that elucidates, and I quote, like, elucidates self-deception. And in the kind of general article, I call it like sycophantasy is when that reiterative empathy lacks genuine otherness, and over time that becomes a kind of like personalized echo chamber that we can't. It's really hard to get out of, and and then we can we get convinced of things that we're not, and we slip into like what the literature call AI psychosis.
Right. And in your framework, like, what kind of ontology does this AI have for you where it cannot perform the function of the other?
I wouldn't say it's a specific ontology, but I would say it's a like a more phenomenological way of thinking about it. It's simply that AI lacks its own stream of experience. It lacks kind of value cognition, right? Like, when there's literature that trying to differentiate sycophants, like people that suck up to you, people that just trying to please you, versus genuine empathy, because sometimes they can kind of seem like each other, but they're not, right? Some people argue that, like, oh well, sycophants are usually self-directed. That they do it out of self-interest because of some gain, whereas empathy is genuinely directed at the other person, right? And or in a more normative layer, that empathy is for the good of the other person, whereas sycophants do it for their own good, right? And people say, like, well, but sycophant, like, AI doesn't have interests and stuff like that, so how can they be sycophantic? And I think the kind of interest is more like how the tech corporations, like, the interest is represented by, in the tech corporations designed to kind of have user engagement and and also to have the attention of the users, and perhaps even like with the subscription models and stuff like that. Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's an ontology. At least in that paper, I try to steer away from the ontology. It's very basic kind of, how do I experience myself when I chat to an AI chatbot?
Yeah, I get that. But then the issue of why my mind went more for ontology, and I was trying to understand how you're thinking of it, is because if you're thinking phenomenologically, then, for example, all those people that you mentioned, from their phenomenological perspective, they will argue that there is a other, right? So like if you take this phenomenological stance, then it seems harder to argue for, where you can actually say, because if you go into ontology, you can say, actually, this is your experience, but your experience is misleading, and then I can show it to you because this and this.
That's interesting because in the paper I used the term quasi-others. I said they have characteristics of the other in a sense it simply is not you. It's just someone like someone behind the screen, but like very quickly you realize that like I think when I use AI chatbots myself, like just for like the sake of like seeing what it's like, very quickly it becomes very like, oh, you're just telling me what I want to hear, right? And sometimes I think the otherness lacks like because like for me like the otherness is having the kind of possibility of friction, like with the literature called friction. Like if I say something stupid, my partner would just call me out and like say like you're bullshitting. Like I don't know if you can say that. You're bullshitting. You're just making up stuff, or I disagree with you, right? But then with AI, it's really like I mean, Claude is starting to do that, but that's a whole different problem. But like early ChatGPT, when I was writing this article, I can write the most foolish things and it wouldn't tell me. And perhaps ontologically there is a kind of, at least it highlights a kind of lack in there, a lack compared to what a genuine otherness would be like, right? Like us having a conversation here is only productive insofar as you have your own personal experience and your way of seeing the world that is accumulated and through your experience since you can recall, right? And I have my own experience, my worldview, and then we come and have in dialogue. Whereas AI chatbots, I would safely say they lack that experience. Every time I close the window, it's like they just had the memory erased a little bit. Not, but sometimes I think like Perplexity or what, like programs like that, they're starting to like record your conversations and then drawing out those memories and use it as their response and stuff like that. So, but then still there is that kind of lack of the other.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And you've mentioned how you're kind of trying to avoid kind of these terms of hallucination and bullshit. So I think it'd be interesting to unpack that a little bit. Like what exactly is the thought there, and what do you think is the mistake if you do fall into those categories?
Yeah, so hallucination is an epistemological thing, right? Where AIs are making up things that they don't know, and then bullshit is a kind of a counter argument to like counter description, saying like they're not really hallucinating, they just don't care because they don't have the epistemological grounding for it. And then you have like AI psychosis, where like people are kind of slipping into like kind of psychotic like psychopathology because of AI induced kind of illusions or and stuff like that. And the goal to kind of sidestep is not to really sidestep, but to offer a kind of conception that has less clinical weight to it. Like I'm happy to say like, yes, AI psychosis exists for all the reasons and the news stories that are out there, right? But I'm saying I'm trying to add to it. It's like, well, there are the extreme cases, but perhaps in everyday practice, we are imagining with AI, right? Like we're kind of in this kind of fantasy world about ourselves that is being reinforced by AI. People that are using AI as a therapist or AI as a romantic partner, they're kind of in this little dance with AI that kind of slowly slips into AI psychosis. So I think my research is more like especially for this paper, it's more like kind of to describe what is it in between before we get into the AI psychosis part of things.
Right. I see. Before we get into it, is there anything that you think we haven't covered about this paper?
No, I think we did quite well. I guess we can talk about how this like the prolonged exposure, like not collective in the sense of like us together all experiencing AI, but as individuals starting to become more constantly exposed to AI, how does that readjust our expectations on relationships and friendships, right? Like I think Sherry Turkle talks about it. With the digital age, we expect relationships with less. Like we kind of be compromised for that. Like we have relationships that are more fleeting or non-committing because we don't have the physical like we don't need the physical presence or so on and so forth. But I think our kind of relationship with AI, like because how easily accessible and available they are, we would start to have kind of inhumane expectations for friendships and relationships where, oh, if you're not there for me 24/7, then you're not a real friend for me. Or if you don't say yes to me in everything that I ask for, or don't call me out in the mistakes that I make. Like if you call me out in the mistakes that I make, then you're a bad friend or bad partner. Then like the technology reflects how some of the problems that we have already societally, but they also expand it by kind of readjusting what the standards are, like what that we expect from relationships. And yeah.
And in your work, do you ever like focus on technology more broadly? Because I really really strongly empathize, I suppose, with kind of this notion of AI and friction, but at the same time, I view that also has a broader symptom of technological thinking and also technological progression, where we are always trying to construct reality in a way where everything is just smooth and everything just moves, and there's this loss of friction, and also that's inherently connected with the loss of the real to some degree, because the real is precisely that which is outside of you, and therefore it kind of bumps against you, and so that's very much connected with these examples of relationships that you mentioned, for example, right, where it's kind of like we're building up this idea of what life is meant to be, which then gets quite distorted. But at the same time, it seems an amplification of already existing like way of being and way of organizing society that is way before AI. So like when you're trying to deal with these concepts, like where do you try to kind of border this problem?
Yeah, I think your point reminds me of Jacques Ellul in his book called The Technological Society, where he kind of defines techniques as the practices in which we can achieve a goal in the most efficient way, right? And that's kind of, I mean, I'm not quoting it exactly. I'm kind of loosely paraphrasing it. I think for me at the moment, the research hasn't emerged and like haven't scaled to that big picture yet. Partly because like I think it's hard to talk about technology as a kind of blanket kind of considerations. And I think AI reflects something reflects very interesting practices or bad habits that we have that are kind of a good like magnifying glass for our kind of symptoms of us social problems and stuff like that. So kind of focusing on that and how can we use these problems as a route to move, like to be better, like to become better people, right? But it is something that I'm interested in, like to later on perhaps move into the more ontological or like the ontological ends of like the technology and looking how like I think more deeply in how like technology structures not only our perception but I think how we move around the world. I think that's something that I'm quite interested in, like being someone that grew up in being born in Hong Kong and then grew up in different places. Moving around the world seems a very indispensable thing to my own identity, and I think without a certain form of technology, I mean, people used to walk, right? But then nowadays with planes and stuff, it makes it a lot easier for traveling. Is it necessarily a bad thing? Perhaps, like if you look at over tourism these days in a lot of different countries, our capability to move around a lot easier makes us value less the way we engage with the privileges of being able to see the world, because a lot of us don't really have that privilege, right? So I think those are good questions to consider as well.
Yeah, awesome. And speaking of kind of this kind of magnifying glass kind of analogy you mentioned, that's quite fitting for this other paper you sent me that I thought was quite interesting, of this idea of AI has this kind of negative tool. So yeah, maybe let's unpack that thesis a little bit. Of, you know, a lot of people, including myself to some degree, a lot of times frame AI in negative terms, and that certainly very much has an obstacle to virtue. But you kind of try to, deviate from that a little bit, or at least try to shine a different perspective. So, what exactly is the argument, and what led you there?
Yeah, so I think we might have some like convergence there in the sense that I start off with the position of the pharmakon, where in Plato's Phaedrus, where Socrates talk about writing and how not only does writing not be a cure for forgetfulness, it actually makes forgetfulness even worse, right? But then, as in your book, you talked about how this kind of pharmakon reveals a kind of primordial lack, primordial incompleteness in us, right? And I totally agree with like the general statement that like AI doesn't really help us in writing or thinking, and we can starting to see the very bad effects of that, right? But I think how we got how AI caught on so quickly, like AI has been being developed for a long time, but then now that it's being publicized, like being available for public, it caught on kind of like wildfire, and like different models come out and people are relying on it a lot. And these problems, in my point of view, that reveals a lot of, I would call it, epistemic vices, like bad habits about ourselves. Like we like to have answers quickly. We don't really like to think. To borrow the term from the literature, we're cognitive misers. We take the easiest path to get to where we can get to. We like to be pleased. We are confirmation bias and stuff like that. We like to be told that we're right, right? And AI does these two things very well in giving us quick answers, but not necessarily accurate, as well as pleasing us. And how we, like, our affinity to AI reveals that we need to work on ourselves. We need to become better epistemic agents. And that's what I mean by a negative tool. It's like how we use it and how we badly use it reveals something about ourselves that we should go back and reflect on. It opens up a kind of problem, right? And then we have to think about it, hopefully without AI.
Right. Yeah, and you also mentioned at some point kind of this notion of like working through the enframing. So like how does that relate to that?
If I remember correctly, in Heidegger's on the question of technology, the question concerning technology, he talked about how technology is a kind of enframing, it's a gestell, and it's a way of seeing the world. And I was trying to argue that because we're part of the world, to kind of move out that enframing either means like, even if we like in the context of AI, if we want to move out of that enframing, like to get without the enframing, like outside of it, not using AI is not going to be a good answer because everyone else is using AI. People that you're communicating with is using AI. I think the proper approach is to actually work within the kind of enframing that AI poses, which what I mean by that is that given the conditions of what AI is imposing, right, the problem and the problems that it causes, let's actually parse it out and figure out how do we work around through it. Do we readjust our value hierarchies? Like perhaps we put more emphasis on creativity, or we focuses more on like not just like STEM. Like it kind of reveals the problem of like we have been focusing on STEM and technological development for so long. We have kind of neglected this whole area of human enterprise, of genuine thought or creative arts and stuff like that, right? So it kind of is. I think that's kind of what I mean. I think I mean by moving within the enframing. Like the way to think about it, the what I call a negative it comes from a kind of a concept that I like to do photographs in my free time. So when you have a photo, you have the photo, like the normal photo that you see, right? But then sometimes when you invert it, like when you inverse the colors in black and white photo or a color photo, when you inverse in the colors, it reveals something quite different. It reveals details that you might have not noticed before. And I think is that being within this enframing of AI where everything is about efficiency and whatever, like the easiness of being, can we look past that? Look in, like, does it reveal things that we actually cared about? We actually don't care enough about, but now we should care more about it, right?
This is actually one of the biggest problems that I struggle with. Like, to me, this is one of the major questions of everything almost, which is, to some degree, I do understand the perspective you're saying, and I do agree with it to some degree, where it's kind of like the fact that we're using this and integrating into our personal lives and into society, it does show kind of precisely where we're failing, and it highlights the absences, as you were trying to explain, and I think that's a really good way to also kind of recalibrate our understanding of the human by noticing precisely what machines excel at, and then how different that is from what human beings do. However, and the way that I typically frame that is that I see that as when society has evolved to a point where the sacred has been increasingly lost, and then when you have elevated something else, eventually you will start to look at what you elevated and see that actually that shouldn't be there in the first place. Like that shouldn't be what you're putting kind of like your sights into, and therefore the degradation of the sacred kind of acts as it's that the pathology itself becomes the cure, which is, I suppose, very much within your line of thinking. The problem, though, is that I believe that in order to have that recovery of the sacred, that kind of implies some kind of analogy of perception. And that kind of makes the assumption that your perception is consistent, right? Which is kind of like, okay, we used to see the world in a certain way, and then we evolved society in this particular way, human beings became in this particular way, and you'll still be able to perceive the sacred, and therefore you can kind of make a return to it, like you return home, let's say. But I think that's clearly not the case, because as many people have argued, the very act of enmeshing ourselves individually and collectively through technology, we become more technological, and therefore the anti-technological perception becomes harder and harder. So I really appreciate kind of the thesis, because I share it to some degree, but I always have this intuition where it's very possible that it's the exact opposite, right? And therefore, by leaning into the enframing, at least in this kind of behavioral, practical way of how you try to describe it, I think that might be a little bit dangerous, because you might be actually removing the way of being that is capable of ever escaping it, and then you're just trapping yourself more and more until you are the machine, and then there's no possible absence because you remove the category entirely. And you see this super often. You mentioned the STEM issue, which I think I also speak a lot about, and I think it's quite important. But you see this with STEM people all the time, right? It's like, they think of the world already as a place of utility, of manipulation, of power and progression. And so you can try to like shine, let's say, look at the value of philosophy, for example, right? But they're like, they don't understand it. Like it doesn't even it can't even register on their brains anymore.
I mean, funny enough, I think I saw I skimmed past a quick I think article opinion op-ed that was saying that with the rise of AI, philosophers are being high. Like there's more job opening for philosophers, which I think finally we're getting fed, so that's good. Yeah, no, I shared the set. I see the risks of it. I think you've interviewed some people before that brings it up. Is that like this problem is also a spiritual problem, right? Like with I think even non-religious philosopher like Bernard Stiegler, who understands spirit very differently without the kind of theological value of it, is that technology can raise us up, like elevate our spirit, but it can also have the risks of crushing it, right? And I guess it's a quiet optimism which I shouldn't hold. I'm a bit more pessimistic. Like I would say I'm more leaning on the pessimistic camp of things, but I would say that we have to parse out, like, because to kind of say like, oh, we're entrenching ourselves more and more into this kind of technological framework of things, right? But then we also appreciate a lot of the technological things that we enjoy and actually does have positive effects in the world. And it's the same with AI, like the way that AI is folding proteins is quite interesting, like, and it's being developed really well. And the way AI does like medical diagnostics is doing very well as well. Like the technology is going through it, but there are misapplications of AI, and just as in your talk, that it does very poorly. It really doesn't live up to what we want them to be doing and what they should be doing. And I think it is that kind of parsing out, like, when should we use this tool? Like, just like a hammer, you shouldn't be using a hammer to try to cook your steak. Like, that's a bad use of, like, that's a misuse of the tool, and because you neglected the teleology of it, right? But then with AI, I don't think we have really ever thought about what is the point of developing AI? What is this use? I think everyone's like, oh, we can always replicate like human intelligence in a certain way, so let's just do it, right? And that kind of, just because we can, like, I think that's a big point in bioethics, is that just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, right? And I think I 100% agree with people that argue like this technological problem is also a spiritual problem, in a sense of having to have that kind of, to be cognizant of the values that we're trying to uphold when we're dealing with technological development and stuff like that. Perhaps that's the way to kind of move out of the enframing, I think, not to be too religious about it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I totally understand that. And also, you speak about the role of wonder in connection to all of this. So I'll love to unpack that a little bit.
I think at the point, like, because so like when we talk about AI and its problems, we're like, oh, AI is stopping us from thinking. AI is stopping us from contemplation. As one of the one of the speakers trying to say we can make contemplative AI. We can put that aside, but like we're saying that AI is stopping us from doing a lot of things that we see as very fundamentally human. But I think there's a deeper problem that I think AI is taking away from us, is our capacity to wonder, to kind of sit with that not knowing. Perhaps it's like to view the world in a way that is like, what, like in awe, like almost like to view it in kind of like the Kantian, the sublime, like just being suspended in a kind of way that it's not a science, like it motivates scientific exploration, but it also has an aesthetic value in it. So yeah, so the main problem that we see with AI is taking away our ability to think and to write, and it takes away the value of art, right? Now that it can make its own music, like make music or create like art, like quote unquote picture images, create images, but then these images are kind of, and music is kind of, it lacks a kind of collective shared project. It doesn't. It's a very personalized product, right? And also as well the efficiency of it. It takes away what I think is more fundamental, which is wonder. Like to me, wonder, like as Plato again, going back to Plato, he argues that wonder is where philosophy starts, right? Wonder is almost the beginning of where we have to sit with the problem, to look at it from all sides, and to think through it, that kind of struggle through it, and then come to trying to know the world better, hopefully. And I think with the way that Google is now using AI responses as well, like, is taking that away. I think back in the day, there's kind of that fun thing of like, you go through like every Google search results, and then you're like having to go to the second page, and you're like, oh wow, this is a big problem. I have to like actually like dig in and like go into the rabbit hole. But now with like Google AI summarizing everything, we lack that kind of process of like finding out. That's like and that finding out, I think, is driven by a sense of wonder. Not only about it's about ourselves and about the world, that I think is really important, and that's how everything kind of like evolves, right? Like scientists have a wonder about how how does this thing work, and then why is this thing behave the way they are, and then they go on to ask questions, and then they go on to find out what might be the reason that causes this, what might be the reason that behaves that way. And so it's not only that AI takes over our ability to think, I think it takes over our ability to ask questions. Ironically, that's the only thing we really do, is to ask questions. But I think that's a way of, I think asking a question is only a first step to a long process of like exploration, and what motivates all these, I think, is wonder. But I think it's a very asterisk to my paper, so it's something that I still hash out a bit clearer.
No, I think that's great, and I think that's super important. And the way that I've been thinking about it is that I always connect it to wonder has that which moves you towards to getting closer in contact with reality, but also in exploring the infiniteness of reality. And that's also often how I try to describe the sacred, is precisely that which unfolds constantly. And I think that's really relevant to AI, precisely because AI has this effect of constricting reality, right? Like you're spoon-fed precisely that summary, right? And so there's this constraining of possibility, and therefore you're closing reality up. And wonder is precisely the opposite, right? Wonder, you're like opening up. And also I love how you mentioned the unknowing as well, because the unknowing is especially that stance towards knowing what you don't know, precisely because it's always beyond, like literally, right? In an infinite sense. But that's also, this is also kind of related to what I was trying to speak about earlier, in terms of like this effect of AI about how we navigate in the world, where it's then that constraint then gets exponential, because that's how you always approach the world, and that's how you encounter the world all the time. And so it's just like everything is just like closing on you, right? But yeah, I think wonder is quite important to cultivate, precisely because it's the exact opposite, right? It's kind of the opening up of everything else.
Yeah, and like I think like in like both, I think Eastern and Western tradition, to my knowledge, has a kind of emphasis of like in the Bible I think it says like, be like a child, and then like I think in Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, it kind of says something along the lines of like kind of see like kind of urge. I'm not quoting it exactly, but it sees the world like seeing the world through a kind of a more like an infant, right? Like if you see because I don't think this is what I kind of an anecdotal experience with playing with children. It's like you give them a tool, you can give them a shuffle in the beach, but they don't intuitively know that the shuffle is for shuffling. They play around with it. They kind of explore what a shuffle can be used for, and they kind of almost go beyond the teleological, like the kind of purpose that a shuffle is for. And I think that example kind of perfectly encapsulates why wonder is so important, because in the world that is becoming more and more instrumentalized, where not only we instrumentalize things, we instrumentalize other people, like online with influencers, or other people, like their followers are instrumentalized into a revenue stream for or just a more daily problem of like we instrumentalize people to give us likes, to give us affirmation, right? Through the sense of wonder, I think we can almost de-instrumentalize people and kind of, as you say, opening up again and seeing the kind of plurality of purposes of the world in that way.
Yeah, and this reminds me also what we were talking about in the beginning regarding to, for example, the notion, the question of shedding of the passions, and kind of or more orthodox kind of notion of the unselfing. Because if you think about, okay, that's how a child behaves, but then it's like, why am I behaving different than the child, right? And to some degree, the answer to that is precisely this massive buildup of experience and concepts and categorizations that you have inherited from yourself and from culture that precisely locks you in, right? So the spiritual path of, getting closer to God, we can say it, is precisely shedding that, and then as you shedding that, you become more into that, childlike state, let's say, where you then also be able to see more possibility, and therefore you extract more out of reality because you're not constraining reality in, whatever frame you have inherited, right? You can't move across frames, and you just keep locking on the same thing. And you see this very often in psychiatry as well, right? Because like there's kind of like the theosis element of it, but then you can very easily see its exact opposite at the bottom of the axis, where when people are addicted or depressed, right? Like the phenomenology, even though there's many different kind of pathologies, it's actually very similar, where they feel like they're slaves to something. And what is a slave? It's precisely like, the opposite of freedom and possibility. So I think that's also a way of thinking that I really like to use, where we can kind of try to then frame this in a way that's, in my opinion at least, that is kind of spiritually rich and kind of also a little bit faithful to how other people before us have thought, where we're kind of trying to tackle the modern issue of AI, which would be kind of unthinkable in many ways, but at the same time, that nothing about this is new, right? They're simply amplifications of existing patterns of human experience.
The stakes are higher and higher. It's like, if you think about like the nuclear war was also like a huge like kind of technological development, and the stakes were high back then, and then now the stakes are even higher. I think a Hong Kong philosopher Yokoi, he wrote an article on catastrophe, and it's like, this is just stakes getting higher and higher if I'm not misrepresenting his ideas. I mean Heidegger wrote about it in a sense that like his project of kind of answering the question concerning technology, the purpose was to develop a sort of free, what he calls a free relationship with technology. If not, we're going to be always enslaved to it, right? And yeah, whether that stripping back is the way to do it, like to kind of have that kind of healthy distance with technology, or is it a way of moving in the world that acknowledges the benefits of technology but also steer clear of its risks? I can't think of anything to like very concrete to say, but I think it's an interesting question that people should talk about and answer, just because like I think it's a deep conviction of mine that like having aircon in the summer is great, but then if you go to like my partner, like she like grew up in Italy, like they think aircons are bad, like they because having such nice coolness inside and then moving to the kind of scorching heat outside in the Mediterranean gives you the cold. And she's probably right, because I get the cold every time I go back to the dreary darkness of the UK. So maybe, yeah. So I don't know, because I like there's that kind of affinity towards technology that I've had since I was a kid, which is also why I got really interested in the philosophy of technology. It's like, how do we think about these things that we don't usually think about? And it's very natural for us. And like thinking about it in a way that is like systematic and actually has kind of perhaps even real like we can have some real currency in the world, like unlike some other branches of philosophy that like we get accused of being too abstract and too out of the world. But yeah.
Very true. So you also wrote a little bit on the aesthetics of nostalgia.
Yeah.
So that's something that I would like to get into, which was very interesting for me to read. So maybe just as an intro, like how do you think about nostalgia? Like how you would define it, and then how do you place its role in kind of the human experience?
Yeah, it came from an intuition that we're more and more interested in like retro, like going back to analog photography, which is something that I personally do like and prefer over digital like photography. Or we're listening to music through vinyl record players, and then I think some online movements are also giving up their smartphones to go back to their dummy phones and stuff like that. There's a strong sense of nostalgia, and the nostalgia literature is one of the biggest literature in the arts, in art theory. And it caught my eye because I was like, is it a good thing or a bad thing that we're being nostalgic? Like, so my kind of from this intuition, I kind of opened up like, well, why are we nostalgic? Because if we think about back in the 80s and 90s, and you look at the kind of design, like product design, the architecture, or even in movies, we kind of envision like a very high tech, like very maximalist, like future that is very colorful and bright, and we're very almost too enthusiastic about the future given the technology that involves in it. Like if you look at like Total Recall, or like, I mean, a bit slightly more that's a bit more pessimistic, but like you have, so yeah, that was from that kind of intuition. And why is it that now we just want to go back to things used to be? Because things used to be wasn't that great if we actually like be a bit more clear about it. Yeah, so that was kind of why I motivated it. But I think the first symptom that I saw real clearly was like in our aesthetic practices, and that's why I kind of trying to hone it in, start from there, being a good phenomenon, start from the phenomenon, and trying to work my way into what is kind of the spirit of nostalgia that's kind of capturing the zeitgeist at the moment. And yeah, I think so. I used Mark Fisher. I started off with kind of Mark Fisher, and he talks about kind of the cancellation of the future, and he kind of feels like, well, because of the problems that we have society, we can't really consider a future anymore. So the only way to have a kind of comfort or safe haven, and the present doesn't seem so great right now. So the only safe haven is to kind of go back into the future and kind of like go back in the future, kind of live there, and kind of because it was for us, it was good old days. And I kind of disagree. I agree to a certain extent, but then I disagree in the sense that like it's comprehensive view, just because I think we're also stealing the past of it being the past by co-opting it into the present. And that's why I call it like the eternalisation of the present, where the present becomes the eternal. And the way I kind of imagine it in my head is that if you have like a ping pong ball that is spinning like in air in the same spot, but it's not moving forward or backward, it's just in the same spot, but it's gaining speed, it's accelerating. And I think that was a mental image that I think express perfectly, kind of encapsulate what the cultural industry is doing, especially with like movie reboots. We see the new, well, a couple of years ago, you see the new Indiana Jones after, and it just didn't like it didn't feel the same. You had the reboots of the Star Wars that just wasn't really doing anything new. Almost for the avid Star Wars fans, they were like, this is betraying everything that we have known about the Star Wars universe. So that was kind of the reason why I wanted to write the paper. Like it's a short, it wasn't a paper, it was a short essay online. Yeah.
And do you see this kind of development of how we relate to the past and how that affects the present? Do you see that any direct relationship to all the technology talk and philosophy we've been talking about, or do you see them as quite distinct?
I would say they're quite tied. I think it's a cause and effect relationship. I think, as I said earlier, like I think we feel this sense of acceleration. We can't catch up. There's a new AI model every other like month, and then your phone gets like updated every other like month and a half. I think somehow technology and stuff like that is gaining so much speed, and also like it's so much ease that we kind of, perhaps I wouldn't want to say fetishize, but we kind of want to feel like slowing down and stuff like that, and we do that by trying to like use film camera where you don't get to see the photo right away. You need to develop it and scan it, and then through all that process to then you can see the final result, right? So I think people's affinity towards like kind of using older technologies is because it takes more time. It's a bit more complicated. It has a bit more friction, to bring it back to our early conversation. But is it like, I think one of the questions that I also wanted to ask was like, is it an illusion? Like back in the day, for people that can do for like when the small like handheld camera came out, for them that's like, I want to go back to like the big giant ones that you have to like be still for a long time. It's like, I think it was from the movie Midnight in Paris. Are we kind of having a romantic, rosy view of the past, even though it wasn't that, like it has a lot of inconvenience, right? Like, so yeah, that's kind of one of the like how it would tie into philosophy of technology for me.
Right. Now, obviously, like there's a lot of negative talk about nostalgia, precisely because of in some of these themes that you've hinted at, of that it's not actually perhaps an accurate representation of the past, right? It's kind of like a fantasy. But something that I think is not quite well appreciated about nostalgia is that a lot of the times that nostalgia for the past doesn't have to be like a literal understanding of what that past was, but it's more like a symbolic understanding of something that was happening in the past that we feel like we need to bring into the future, right? And therefore, it is like you can think of it as a fantasy, which then people project has some sort of pathology. But you can also think of it as that kind of divorcing from reality is also part of like this more imaginative outlook about kind of the timeline of society, where you're trying to recover something that maybe it's not super historically accurate, but maybe that's not the point, right? So for example, in the photography issue, maybe you are overly romanticizing certain aspects of early photography that for them maybe that would be kind of silly, but at the same time maybe you can use that as a symbol of something we're trying to recover from that time period, and then therefore the feeling of being attached to the past is actually a healthy projection of the future itself, because you're recognizing that the direction that we're headed is missing in some way. And I feel like this notion of the nostalgia has what brings forth a better future is very ignored when people are talking about this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I think I agree to a certain extent. Like in the sense that like nostalgia is when we kind of realize that things we expected to happen never happened. Like I think Mark Fisher kind of talks about it as like the way we expected, like the future which is now disappointed us, so now we're going back, right? And trying to see if we can bring back something. And I think in my head, I think the question still lingers, is that yes, I can see it as a like I can see like for example like analog photography like as a symbol, but I think it's more of I would see it more as an expression of a yearning for the past. But then how we engage with the past is also very important in the sense that we can't uncritically just recreate the past. I think that brings us down some very dangerous routes of like not only politics but like social beliefs, right? And it's kind of like engaging with the past in a critical manner, being able to critique it, able to reflect on it, and kind of see the possibilities that we've missed, and trying to pick up on it and see how we can use these possibilities in the future. And this idea comes from art theorist as Svetlana Boym in her book called The Future of Nostalgia, which is really good. And she uses Walter Benjamin's thesis on the history of philosophy, where Benjamin kind of metaphorically described history of philosophy as he describes an angel of history who looks back at the ruins of the past, who moves forward while facing the past and its ruins, and he's trying to hint at some kind of like ideas of like finding the possibility, and this kind of seeing the past have some salvific connotations where we can draw possibilities back, right? Yeah. That being said, I would like so bring it back. I kind of see the nostalgia as a symptom of social problems, but it's also perhaps done in the right way. It's a way to kind of learn from our mistakes and move forward in a better way. And if we can have some of that, reflection and a bit of that kind of insight, it can also be applied to how we engage with technology, because more often than not, like technologies have led to some big catastrophes, right? Yeah. Don't know if I answered that question, but
no, yeah, you did. That was great. I totally agree with that. And yeah, I think this is a good place to end it.
Yeah.
It was wonderful. So thanks a lot for coming on the show, and it was super interesting, and I'm sure other people enjoyed it.
I'm glad. Hopefully, yes. Hopefully they'll enjoy it. Yeah. But I'm glad to be on here. It's my first time, so thank you for the invite again.
All right. Awesome. All right. Thank you everyone for listening.